So welcome and hello everyone to this sixth session of the EuMIGS lecture series and joint course 2025 on decentering migration. This lecture is entitled Looking Beyond the Left Behind, Immobility, Emigration and the Source Country Perspective. And I have the great pleasure to welcome Yasmin Ortiga, who is an associate professor of sociology at Singapore Management University. Before joining Singapore Management University in 2018, Yasmin Ortiga was a lecturer at the National University of Singapore and a research fellow at Nanyang Technological University, also in Singapore. She obtained her PhD in sociology in 2015 from Syracuse University, I hope I pronounced it correctly, in New York in the US. And in the last 15 years or so, Yasmin Ortiga has published widely on topics related to international migration, but also the sociology of education. And her research has focused in particular, among other topics, on skilled migrants, such as nurses and academics, and on countries and regions from where these migrants originate. She has also studied aspiring skilled migrants, including international students, and looked at the ways in which changing ideas of what desirable skills are shape transnational migration and mobility. In her talk today, Professor Ortiga will explore the perspectives of sending countries and regions and of aspiring migrants and how they navigate the process of living amid increasing costs and barriers within their own countries. So thank you very much, Yasmin Ortiga, for accepting to give this talk today. I'm very much looking forward to it. Just as a reminder of how the structure of this session today is going to be, it's basically as in the previous weeks. We will have a 40 minutes lecture approximately, so until 12 here in Switzerland, which I think is 7 p.m. in Singapore. And then we'll have a very short 5 minutes break. And we'll continue in the second part with the students who are taking this as a course and who are going to discuss the two questions that Yasmin Ortiga is going to ask in the very end of her talk in the breakout groups for about 20 minutes. And we'll come back, all of us together, for the last 30 minutes. And also, I think Professor Ortiga can stay another 30 minutes to discuss what you have been talking about in the breakout lectures and also answer questions that you might have about her talk. Yes, so thank you very much again for accepting to be here today with us, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. Hi, everyone. This is an interesting setup. I see some folks are in classrooms all together, and some folks are alone, maybe, or not. It's funny because I teach here in Singapore. It's 6 p.m. in the evening, but I just taught my social inequality class, where half of the class is made up of exchange students, and all of them come from Europe. So it's a little funny to then be in an online class with folks from Europe as well. Must be a sign this was meant to be. Before we start, I just like to get a sense of where we're all coming from. So I have 3 questions, and I'd like folks to maybe give me a thumbs up or raise your hand if you're in a room, if this applies to you. So bear with me. I just want to get a sense of who I'm talking to. First question, has anyone applied for a job outside your current country of origin and didn't get it? See, like thumbs up. Hi, Panos. I see you. Others? No? Looking, just scrolling down. This is what's so hard about Zoom. Okay, not too many, not too many. Some thumbs up there. Okay. Second question, has anyone applied for a visa and got rejected? Oh, okay. A few, very few. And lastly, has anyone chosen or maybe decided to pursue a particular academic major or degree because you wanted to be globally employable, meaning to work somewhere else outside your country? I see. I see University of Salzburg. Okay. Great. So I asked those questions because that's basically my own starting point, and it's how I'm going to segue into the lecture for today. So I'm Yasmin. I come from the Philippines. And when I was in university, this was one of the biggest headlines, right? The Philippines is known as a country that sends out a lot of migrants. And at the time that I was in university, the big headline was that the doctor who had topped our medical board examinations, the national board exam, had basically made a decision to move to the US as a nurse, right? And for those of us who are taking this course, this might not sound super surprising. We've heard this story before, right? On how many developing nations have this brain drain dilemma where some of their most highly skilled professionals choose to leave because there's just better prospects elsewhere rather than staying in place. If you look at any literature on some of the biggest sending countries, most of whom are, most of which are based in in Asia, you'll find that that's the kind of narrative that people tend to study, right? About the global South, right? So there's all this, especially the Philippines has been the subject of numerous books and numerous journal articles on the departure of highly skilled and in some ways how the state encourages that because they send back remittances that improves the lives of their families as well as the country's economy. So I think most of us know this story, and Europe has been a very popular destination for many migrants, a lot of whom come from Asia. But when I started my doctoral studies, I think it was in 2009, and then I began start to do fieldwork. This was the headline that I had encountered, right? So suddenly, nursing, which was a field that used to be very in demand in destination countries like the US and UK, had suddenly turned into the opposite. So suddenly, the main destinations like the US had decided to stop issuing visas for foreign nurses. And so a lot of these overseas opportunities more or less disappeared, right? You could still leave as a nurse for, in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or Singapore, but these weren't the most desired destinations. And so as a result, we had a situation back home where a lot of young people had invested in pursuing a particular degree because they wanted to be globally employable, but then found themselves with nowhere to go because the opportunities that they had been training for weren't there anymore. A lot of them may have tried to apply for work in these places, but then they got rejected. And of course, it was very hard to get a work visa, right? So all those three questions I had asked you earlier, that was basically the situation I had encountered as a doctoral student interested in studying migration. So instead of this story of people just leaving and the dilemma of how to keep people in place, what I found was that there were most of the people I had decided to interview were feeling quite stuck and unable to leave. And so I wanted to find a way to study this. And I was trying to find a place for myself as someone who was studying people who were stuck in migration studies. And at that time, it was really quite difficult. It was very hard to find a place for yourself when you were studying people who were unable to move. I did write some stuff on this. Sorry, I'm just putting this there. So I had talked a lot about education as something that had been more or less reshaped to help people move overseas. But in the end, right, what happens when they're unable to do so? So why was it hard to find a place for myself? Basically, this is because migration studies as a whole tends to have what I call two major biases. First, there is an overfocus on immigration issues in destination countries. So if you look at the literature, there's a lot of stuff on second-generation immigrants, on integration, on race, discrimination in the workplace, and social cohesion, right? These are important issues, and they mostly occur in the destination country after immigrants have arrived within a particular territory. In contrast, we don't really know a lot about the countries that these migrants come from, right? So questions of emigration is not really very mainstream. At the same time, there is an overemphasis on international mobility. So when you say migration studies, the assumption is that you study people who move. And so when I was invited to give this talk, I thought, oh, this would be a perfect opportunity to kind of add a different angle to how we're used to studying migration. And if you think about migration in the context of the global South, a lot of the things we encounter in our research doesn't fit these big mainstream ideas where a lot of the literature has been focused, right? We talk about emigration, we talk about source countries, and we talk about a lot of immobility. So just to kind of flesh it out, a lot has happened since I graduated from my PhD in 2015. So a lot more people have been talking about these biases in migration studies. So I'm going to flesh it out for us now. First, right, this idea of the overfocus on immigration and destinations. I think it would be interesting for people to note that actually emigration used to be a problem in the West, right? So Zolberg had written a book about how there was a time when there were a lot of exit bans or restrictions on exit placed upon workers because there was all this concern about losing productive, skilled workers for the local economy. But these restrictions were eventually removed in the 19th century and led to what Zolberg calls the exit revolution. And because of that, emigration kind of shifted towards a different place in the world. So today, when you think about emigration, it's really associated with the global South, when it wasn't always that way. Then these days, when we think about emigration, there's not as much scholarly excitement because most people assume that in an age of globalization, right, the idea of exit bans or restrictions on people's movement is not something that occurs in the source country. It's more likely to occur in the destination. So I think a lot of us can accept this idea of governments in the US, Germany, placing a lot of restrictions on who can enter. But it's harder to imagine this idea of a country like Indonesia, for example, preventing people from leaving, right? So the assumption is, why would we study emigration when in this global world, can you really prevent people from leaving? You can prevent them from arriving, right? Or entering your territory. But would we really be able to prevent people from just leaving their own country? And then there's what we call this overemphasis on mobility, right? So Carolyn Schuel had written this highly cited piece in International Migration Review where she criticizes this tendency to really only focus on those who can and do move. So when you read any study on migration, it's always about that individual who is able to cross national borders and go through this like migration journey across place and space. Often the assumption with this sort of bias is that immobility is a default situation, right? It's the normal state of being that is then disrupted by migration. It's harder to think of migration being the normal state of being that's disrupted by getting stuck, right, or immobile. But that's the problem, according to a lot of these scholars, that maybe immobility is not as normal as we think it is, right? It's not a default situation for people. So given that, right, a number of anthropologists, geographers, and sociologists have then started asking the question, can we think more deeply about the meaning given to immobility? So rather than just simply the failure to emigrate, does immobility have its own meaning instead of just being the opposite of movement, right? What sort of interpretations do we give to this staying in place? And how does that affect how we think about migration as a whole? So for the rest of my lecture, I'm just going to pitch to you two things that I think we can learn a lot from immobility. And I guess this is me being really excited about the general theme of your whole series of lectures, which is just decentering or trying to move beyond typical ways we've studied migration. So my question is, yeah, so what does immobility reveal that perhaps the regular or typical view of mobility has not or has obscured? So I'll start with the first theme. And I had submitted some readings that I thought people might like. I hope you did. And the first is by Carol Chan, who's an anthropologist who is now based in Chile. But her research is really on Indonesia or emigration from Indonesia. I think one thing that really came out from her piece, right, is that when you look at immobility and you look at the emigration process before people even get to leave their country, one thing that becomes clear is that the migration process begins well before the border, right? So Xiang Biao, another anthropologist, makes this argument that the border is really not the main site for the migration process to happen. And that's because even way before people even get to crossing the border, we already see a lot of the impacts of this desire, aspiration, or intention to leave. And so Carol Chan's article that you had read focuses a lot on what she calls migrant subjectivity, or how people view themselves, right? Or construct this identity based on this idea of becoming a migrant. So she makes this argument that migrant subjectivity is socially produced prior to crossing national borders, and it remains even when people eventually fail to leave the country. And that's what I found super fascinating. So first, you develop this identity as a migrant before you even cross the border out of your country. And then eventually, if you do fail to leave, meaning you never leave your country, apparently this sense of identity remains. And Carol Chan then starts identifying the different social institutions and groups that create that subjectivity. So it's family members, brokers, training agencies, and the state, right? So for folks who may not be so familiar, Indonesia is well known for having a very robust migration industry. If you leave as a migrant domestic worker, which is what most of Carol's participants had done, you have to go through at least about 300 to 500 hours of training before being matched with a potential employer overseas. So when she says training agencies, these are institutions where people stay for maybe weeks, maybe 3 weeks or a month, where they just go through this training program on how to do proper household work or elderly care. So that's what you see in this picture here, right? So they're supposedly learning how to clean, as if that's not something you might do regularly in your normal life. So Carol is basically saying that because the process of becoming a migrant worker requires so much time, training, and going through all of this paperwork of preparing to leave, even if people eventually fail to leave, they actually still retain this status or this thinking of being a migrant. And this is where it gets really fascinating. So Carol, in her piece, talks about how she was trying to navigate how people were referring to each other, right? So there's some people were calling themselves non-migrants, some were calling themselves failed migrants, and then there were people who were calling themselves former migrants. and she was trying to differentiate what that meant. And she finally figured out that a non-migrant is someone who had never attempted and never left the country. But the key there is that they never attempted to do so. Um, a former migrant is basically anyone who had attempted and or left the country and then came back, right? So it includes people who, everyone who had tried to leave, and then everyone who left, eventually left and came back. But this is the most fascinating, this idea of a failed migrant. So here, Carol Chan says that migrants are generally viewed as failures if they did not complete their contracts, if they didn't send much money home, if they were deported, if they got injured at work and then were repatriated home, and if they did not manage to leave the country, right? So the former migrant would include people who were successful, right? Who maybe sent a lot of money home, finished their contract, and came back. But if you fail to achieve any of these conditions, you would actually be considered a failed migrant. And for a while, Carol Chan was very confused because she said, when you think of someone who's a failed migrant, it means someone who wasn't able to leave, right? Like you failed at migration. But actually, what she found is that the definition in the Indonesian context actually included people who actually got to leave, but perhaps did not achieve what they were expected to achieve. What's the implications of this, right? Reading Carol Chan's work and then just doing a basic Google search on the terms former migrant, return migrant, failed migrant, you find that there are really very serious implications as to what migrants encounter when they come back, or what then becomes their situation if they're unable to leave at all. So I don't know if you have a special lecture on reintegration or return, but the major issue is stigma associated with certain migrant experiences. If you didn't finish your contract, if you were repatriated home due to an issue of abuse, a lot of migrants end up not actually having a lot of support when they return. And Carol is basically making this argument that it's because the way this idea of being a migrant is constructed is highly dependent on how a particular sending society views it and creates the expectations and norms for successful migration. And so whether you're able to leave or if you left and didn't achieve what you were expected to achieve, you'd still be considered a failure in many ways. And I thought that was really interesting. And in many ways, this sort of perspective is missing, right? When we think about the migration process. There is a lot written about domestic workers. I come from the Philippines. So I feel like every once in a while I'll encounter numerous, journal articles about domestic workers in Hong Kong, domestic workers in Israel. There's so many contexts where migrant domestic workers are found, but their experiences are often bound within the destination country. And I'm not saying that that's not important. It is. But there's another part of the story that begins way before they even depart their countries of origin. So I move on to the second thing that I think immobility reveals, which is how migration is also governed, right? So if Carol Chan's work looks specifically at the individual and how their subjectivity is kind of shaped by different institutions around them, I personally have been really interested in this idea of how migration can also be governed within the sending country, right? Or within the source country. The reason that why I find this super interesting is that if you read what's available out there, a lot of the literature tends to seesaw between two binaries, right? Source nations are depicted as either helpless, right? Meaning helpless to globalization. There's little we can do to prevent people from leaving, or all powerful. And, like in the case of China, able to keep people in place and prevent them from leaving at all. in many ways, the Philippines is kind of a it's sort of a in the middle ground, because in the case of labor migration, sending countries are depicted as having some control over emigration or the people who leave. But it's often framed in terms of this very developmental perspective, right? When we talk about the source country and we talk about people being sent overseas to work, the assumption is that the sending state is involved because they want to profit off people's remittances. So when they talk about places like Mexico, Morocco, or the Philippines, it's often in terms of how the state reaches out to the diaspora in order to involve them in development projects, or how they try to imbibe some sense of nationalism in order to take advantage of migrant remittances. And I'll talk a little later on about how that seems to be a little incomplete when we think about how states work. Another interesting gap is that when we think about non-migrants, as I said earlier, it often refers to people who have no intention of leaving at all, right? Who had never made an attempt to leave. But it's interesting that we don't really include that in any other sort of theorizing about how migration is governed. Um, this is my mini rant. I read so much stuff about how Americans feel about Trump's policies in the border, or how Germans feel about some refugee policy, or some, an influx, or how the people feel about the influx of foreigners into their borders. But no one really talks about how Filipinos feel about our labor migration regime, or how Sri Lankans might feel about people leaving for domestic work, right? So when it comes to the source nation, non-migrants aren't really part of the picture. And so any sort of theorizing about the sending state has always been linked to this idea of maximizing remittances. And there's always an assumption that everyone agrees with that. So I had also suggested another reading. This is from a book that was just published this year. I published it with Stanford University Press. And basically, the main argument that I make in the book is that when we think about migration governance, it's not really only about facilitating or regulating movement. A key part of the process is also managing the meaning and implications of remaining in place. What might that look like? So I analyze two cases which happened during the pandemic. And this was when the Philippine state had to deal with two big groups of immobile workers. The first is a group of healthcare workers who had been banned from leaving the country. So during the pandemic, the Philippine state had instituted a ban preventing 13 healthcare professionals from leaving the country for overseas work. So this was seen as a response to the pressures that local healthcare institutions were facing due to the pandemic. And take note, as I said earlier, we are one of the major suppliers of migrant nurse labor to the world, right? So this ban was a very big deal. It included other professions like med techs and doctors, but nurses were by far the largest group, right? So these were healthcare workers banned from leaving the country. And then the second group was a lot of service professionals or people who worked in cruise ships or hotels who lost their jobs in the first year of the pandemic and were sent home. So just to give everyone a sense, in the first year, 2020 alone, we had received close to 400,000 migrant returnees in 1 year, right? So this was what the state was suddenly faced with, these two big groups of immobile workers. So I asked this question: how does a sending state, especially a state like the Philippines that had promoted migration through many years, suddenly govern immobile citizens? The argument I make in the book is that a lot of this relies on telling the right story about those who are unable to move, right? There's a lot of work in political sociology as to how state narratives are often created in order to maintain a certain legitimacy or support among political constituency. I make a similar argument, but I say that this story, right, has to be negotiated. So I argue that in cases where you have this group of immobile citizens, often aspiring migrants and the state have to compete in order to promote a narrative that could gain the most sympathy, commiseration, and support from the Filipino public. And that's because the narrative that is most prominent ends up determining how aspiring migrants are treated and how the state is going to be expected to respond to their needs. So I don't have much time, so I'm just going to give you one example. So, in the case of the ban on nurses leaving the country, the state had used this narrative of an emergency measure, right? So, this is our former Department of Labor and Employment Secretary, Silvestro Bello III. And he basically says that, we cannot afford to deploy our nurses abroad. Our whole health system will collapse. By the way, it will not, right? And I talk in the book about how this narrative was a little overblown. But basically, he frames nurses' immobility as temporary, right? It's just an emergency measure. We just have to follow the deployment ban or the ban on them from leaving, and let us try to be patient. Pansamantala lang naman to. Let us, this is only temporary. So the state had used this narrative of we're in a massive emergency, and whatever immobility you're experiencing now is just temporary. So please be patient and help us through this crisis. But as we had established early on, right, the Philippines had come from a period of low demand for nurses abroad. So this was before the pandemic. And as I said, there were so many nurses who had been stuck at home for years because they had pursued nursing to leave the country, but graduated at a time when those opportunities were no longer there. So the nurses had protested the ban by saying that their immobility was involuntary. So they were quite savvy. They immediately formed a group. They called themselves the prison nurses or prisoners, right? A play on the word prisoners, which I thought was really clever. And they basically said that the state is forcing them to remain in the country and work, right? And basically taking away their right to travel and pursue opportunity. And many of these nurses, are reminding the state that you didn't pay for our education. We paid for it ourselves. When we were stuck in the country, it's not as if nursing jobs were lucrative and well paid, right? A lot of it was contractual, and people were often left on their own, right, to figure things out. So when people were stuck in the Philippines before the pandemic, they didn't feel like their labor was celebrated or rewarded in any way that made it worth it. So this nurse, Ruela, was basically saying, I never asked the government for any money, right? And then they exploited us for years. And then now we're the ones being called selfish. So this were basically the nurses were trying to counter the state's narrative by saying that this is not just a temporary call to service, right? This is forced labor and involuntary immobility. But I think later on in the book, what I talk about is that sadly, the state's narrative was the most popular narrative. And this is what the Filipino public had fully supported. So no matter how hard the nurses had pushed, they went on the media, they tried to build allies with various labor groups. In the end, the deployment ban was so popular, and the state had kind of framed it as the perfect narrative, so much so that most regular Filipinos supported the ban and actually felt it was the right thing to do, right? So there was very little sympathy for nurses who were stuck at home. So you might ask, so what, right? Why would we be interested in this whole idea of migration governance and how states might justify immobility? I would argue if you do a simple Google search, you'll find that many states actually immobilize their own citizens amid very popular support from non-migrants within those countries. So sometimes when I present my work, my students here in Singapore will ask, how could the state do this? Aren't the migrants so angry? And I say, the migrants are angry, but everyone else is super supportive of that ban, right? So I don't know if folks know, Indonesia actually had a ban, a 10-year ban from sending migrant workers to Saudi Arabia, supposedly in protest against very, very bad abuse cases at that time. And this was fully supported by the Indonesian populace, right? Seoul, Korea bans travel to parts of Cambodia because there's all this, there was this whole issue of a student who was brought into a scam center and then tortured, right? That is also something that's been fully supported back home. And of course, the Philippines and Kuwait has this ongoing drama where we probably institute a deployment ban every few years. Every time an overseas Filipino worker is a victim of abuse. So all of these bans are super disruptive, right? I remember I had interviewed someone who said, I can't believe the death of one domestic worker can ruin the careers, right? Or affect the career opportunities of like 10,000 other Filipino migrants who were supposed to go to Kuwait, for example. But this is how states basically govern migration. They use both, they facilitate and regulate mobility while also using immobility when it is in their own interests. So, I mean, just to sum up everything, right? To think further as to why this matters, um, I would sum it up in this way, right? Definitions of immobility or how we make sense of those who remain in place can really determine how migrants, whether former migrants or failed migrants, are treated by others in their communities and how their governments or their states are expected to respond to their needs. At the same time, it is often by looking closely at these narratives of immobility or success or failure that we see how a society justifies who gets to leave and who can be forced to stay. And I think that's a missing part of this migration story that hasn't received enough attention yet. Okay, so that's it for this lecture.